class. I'm here to go over the discussion questions for Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener and chapters from Moby Dick. The narrator of Bartleby the Scrivener is a Wall Street lawyer who does a snug little business, as he says, of mortgages and bonds. He believes that the easiest path in life is the best. His business is doing well, so he needs to hire another copyist or scrivener. And years ago, before copy machines, people wrote down word for word what needed to be copied. And they did it by hand. And as you can imagine, that must be a really tedious, boring job, if you will, especially if what you're copying is a legal document. So that's what these scriveners or copyists did. His other scriveners are Turkey and Nippers, and they sort of balance one another out. One of them is very efficient in the morning, and the other one can only work in the afternoon, and yet they're there all day. Sometimes with a bit of conflict, and yet Bartleby comes in. He does a good job at first. The narrator describes Bartleby as pallidly neat, pitiably respectable, and curely forlorn. That's what the narrator sees of Bartleby, and that's how he describes him. We don't get a whole lot about Bartleby. We really don't know him. He's kind of a mystery. And in fact, I don't think we really even know much more of him at the end of the story than we do at the beginning. And he, at some point in his employment with the narrator, he just stops working and says, "I would prefer not to." His boss says, "Hey, let's go over these sheets. Let's make sure everything's correct. We're going to do a proofreading session together," because that's what copyists did. And Bartleby simply says, "I would prefer not to." So somehow this bothers the narrator, but the narrator can't seem to let him go. He attempts to fire him. He attempts to, rather than, and even after that, he doesn't even leave the office. Eventually, the narrator vacates the premise. He leaves his law office. He moves, and yet Bartleby is still there. And the new tenants are like, "Who is this man? What's happening?" Bartleby is thrown into jail, where he just stops living. He stops eating. He stops doing the things that are required to be alive. And that's a mystery. That's a mystery to the narrator. It's a mystery to us as readers. And we don't really get any answers. And that can be kind of frustrating, but that can also be sort of lifelike. Do we ever get any real answers in life? By the end of the story, there's a bit of a postscript where the narrator imagines or hears this rumor that Bartleby had worked at the dead letter office. Now, the dead letter office is a place where mail goes to die. If you get a return to sender, let's say you get a piece of mail and it's not your neighbor's, it's not yours, you write return to sender on it, send it back to the post office. Maybe you don't do that anymore, you just throw it out. But years ago, mail would go to the dead letter office where it was sorted out or burned. And the narrator imagines this. "For the cartload they are annually burned. Sometimes from the folded paper, the pale clerk takes a ring. The finger it was meant for perhaps molders in the grave. A banknote sent in swiftest charity, he whom it would relieve, nor eats nor hungers any more. Pardon for those who died despairing, hope for those who died unhoping, good tidings for those who died stifled by unrelieved calamities. O errands of life, these letters speed to death." He imagines, the narrator does, that Bartleby has been psychically wounded by this experience, and that's what led him to his suicide. It led him to his the let go of his will to live. But we as readers really don't know. And there's a lot of mystery in that. It's very interesting as a theme, and the idea too that we can never really know another person. Like most languages have more than one verb to communicate knowing. In French, there's savoir and connaître, or connaître, and one refers to knowing a fact, or knowing directions, or knowing a recipe, and the other refers to knowing a person, because there is a big difference. You cannot know a person in the same way that you know the square root of 9. So, and that's kind of an interesting idea, I think, that comes up in this story. There are also some other interesting themes that are worth exploring. The setting itself is reflected or reflects those themes as well. The office setting can be one that's often devoid of life. If you go back and you look at the story and the descriptions of the office, you'll see that. Wall Street, a center of commerce, very lively area. The narrator goes for a walk on Wall Street on a Sunday when it's empty, devoid of people. He passes a church. Maybe he's trying to connect with others in some way. And really, we know remarkably little about the narrator and his life, other than he's an elderly lawyer who does a good business and likes things the way they are. He is very much, I think, a mystery, as is Bartleby. So whose story is this? It's hard to say. Perhaps a narrator, even though, again, I said we really don't know much about him, just as we don't know much about Bartleby. On to chapters from Moby Dick. I happen to own this. This is a custom-made peg leg. It fits over my right knee. And if I ever want to dress up as a pirate, I can put this on. How does this relate to Moby Dick? Well, this is not made of ivory, but we get that wonderful character of Ahab, who is the captain of the Pequod, the ship that Ishmael enlists on. And Ishmael, of course, is the narrator of Moby Dick. He goes to sea because he's feeling depressed and angry, like walking through the streets and knocking people's hats off. He's restless. And for him, getting out in the ocean is a cure for that, because he goes as a sailor. He has no responsibilities. It's not like he's a captain or the cook. People can't blame him for serving them shitty food, and they can't. He has no responsibilities as a captain would. So he goes as a common sailor, and it doesn't cost him anything. In fact, he gets paid. So that's why he goes to sea. Now Ahab, of course, is the captain, and he's a little crazy. Look up the word megalomania, and you will see a description of Ahab. He is obsessed with one thing, and that one thing is Moby Dick, the whale that scarred him, the whale that took his leg. And he drags the entire crew down with him. Really, we only have some chapters in this book, but the entire story works on a couple of levels. It was very engaging for people to read this kind of adventurous novel of life at sea, because on the one hand, it's a survival tale. And on the other hand, it is life. It is a microcosm of the world. Ishmael is there, but there are people from all over the world on the ship. There aren't any women, but there are men from all over, all ages, all backgrounds. The harpooners are mainly people from Southeast Asian islands, like Queequeg. He's a mysterious fellow. He's tattooed from head to toe, and at first Ishmael is reluctant to share a room with him, but then he realizes that, he says it's better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunk Christian or something. He says something like that in the early chapters. So there's this common humanity that comes together, and yet they're all sort of stuck under this one crazy leader, and that person is Ahab. He does have people around him trying to talk him out of this hunt for Moby Dick. He's got, oh my God, I've been talking and it has been recording, hasn't it? There are people around Ahab who are trying to talk him out of this crazy hunt. They're like, look, we have enough whale meat, we've got enough blubber and ivory, we can go back and make some money. And he's like, no, we're after that white whale. Starbuck is his first mate, and he is trying to talk him out of it. He's like, you would risk our lives for a dumb brute, and the dumb brute being, of course, the whale. He's saying, he's like, there is no comparison. He's like, this animal had no vengeance for you, and yet that's what you're reading into it, and you're dragging us down with it. It is a tragedy. The entire story of Moby Dick ends tragically. Everyone dies except for Ishmael. The 1956 film of Moby Dick it's a pretty good one. It's kind of strange in some ways, but I think it's interesting to look at. And again, this is another story of hubris or pride, megalomania, and the mystery of the human condition.